Doctors, Josh, therapist of Reddit. Do you have any no, that's not normal stories? If so, what abnormal habit oddity did the patient have thinking it was normal? Story 1. 50-ish-year-old man who came in for chronic issue follow-up. He brought his wife with him this time around. At the end of the visit, she says, "Hey, tell the doc about that thing you can do." He turns to me proudly and tells me that he can whistle from his penis. If he really pushed, he could blow gas from it. His wife insisted it wasn't normal, but he was certain most guys could. Turns out, he had a connection between his bowel and his bladder. Mom brings her kid in because the babysitter was concerned about these spells the child would have. Apparently, the child would have episodes where he would just blankly stare at them and not acknowledge whatever it is they were telling him, or whatever he was doing. The parents just thought he was being in and not listening to them, or being absent-minded. Kid turned out to be having absence seizures. A younger gal who had come in for generalized abdominal pain that she experienced on and off for years, but just always wrote off to either menstrual cramps or bad food or life. We had asked her if her bowel movements were regular, and she said yes. At some point, someone was sharp enough to ask her how often she had bowel movements, to which she said about once every 2-3 weeks. She had been suffering from pretty severe constipation, but just thought it was normal to have BMs once to twice a month. I'm sure I have more, but I think I wrote enough for now. Ninja edit. Oh yeah, I have a lot of stories involving skin lesions. Please people, no doctor will ever fault you for wanting to just get something looked at. There are a few easy ways to tell if you're looking at something potentially evil. Gotta amend the above edit due to people's bad experiences. No decent doctor should blow you off if you're concerned about a skin lesion. They should at least take the time to discuss why it is they're not worried about a lesion, if it's not concerning. Story 2. Woman came to the hospital because she was feeling tired and casually mentioned her persistent vaginal bleeding she'd been dealing with for 2 months. She said it wasn't ever a large amount, so she didn't think twice about it. Labs were done, and her hemoglobin was 3.9. For context, that's low. Like, you should be dying low, but she looked perfectly fine. Story 3. I was the patient, but when I went in for a routine physical, the doctor poked my extended belly and asked how long it had been like that. I laughed and said, "What? My beer belly?" "Oh, since I was 21 probably." Turned out that, no, the beer belly was a cyst that had grown really large, and that was why my friends kept saying I looked pregnant. I thought I just had really shitty friends. Had to have emergency surgery, and for a week or so, they did not know if it was a cyst or ovarian cancer. It was a pretty big scare. Story 4. This was a time I was told something I did wasn't normal. I was in physical therapy, recovering from a back surgery. My in-home physical therapist was having me do stretches and asked me to extend my leg as far as possible and straighten my knee. So I do this and my knee inverts, which to me was totally normal, but my PT was very surprised. She explained that was very abnormal and she had not seen hyperflexible knees like mine before. So now I know my wonky knees are not normal. Edit. It has been really great to find others who are also hypermobile. No one else in my friend.r family group are like this. Edit 2. I've added an illustration of what a hypermobile knee joint looks like for those curious. Story 5. I was the patient. I had no idea that it wasn't normal to uncontrollably sob for 2 weeks out of every month, have breasts so sore I couldn't go downstairs, jiggle, and then have it all stop the day you start your period. It took me getting a female roommate at 30 for me to realize that wasn't typical. I asked my OB/GYN after charting my symptoms for 6 months. PMDD, a depressive disorder that is tied to your menstruation. A change in birth control pills fixed it right up. He also looked at me like I was crazy for thinking that was normal for 16 years. I asked my mom after my diagnosis, "Oh yeah, remember in high school? Your friends would come over and ask if you were crazy that day or not?" "No, Mom, they didn't ask me that." Thanks for letting me know. Story 6. 95-year-old veteran 5 years in remission from kidney cancer. Came in with 72-year-old wife for routine follow-up. She wants to know if it's safe to have every day because she is worried about his health. Yup. 95 yo. Fucks every day, no Viagra? We just said, congratulations. Yes, every day is very good for your reproductive tract, penis, or vagina. It keeps blood flow going and helps you maintain function of your bits for as long as possible. Use it or lose it, essentially. And it doesn't have to be with someone else either. Story 7. Guy in his 20s came in complaining of belly button problem. I examined him. He had an irritated scab inside the belly button caused by aggressive lint picking. But dude was sweaty and had a slight tremor. Looked like. When I asked how he was feeling overall, he said, "Oh, okay, I guess. Just a little tired, drank a little more this week than usual. Probably overdid it." I had to pry for details, and turns out he drank a gallon of gin over the last 3 days and stopped drinking alcohol when he started vomiting large amounts of blood and pooping a mixture of bright red blood and dark sticky stuff. Melena digested blood. He was totally unaware of the fact that he was going through alcohol withdrawal, sweating, shaking, because he hadn't stopped drinking long enough in recent memory to experience symptoms. I sent him straight to the emergency room, where they found a tear in his esophagus that required immediate intervention, and he was admitted for inpatient alcohol detox. I read his hospital note. He still insisted that the ED doc examine his belly button. Story 8. I'm a therapist, and a couple came in and were fighting because they didn't want to have. I told them they didn't have to. They were fairly confused and thought I was lying to them. Now they have 3 kids. Story 9. When I finally got on medication for my anxiety, I found out getting irrationally angry and frustrated, almost to the point of crying and screaming at people for touching things certain ways, putting the dishes away wrong, chewing, moving my stuff a few inches, or talking to me when I didn't feel like talking was, in fact, not normal. Thank God for Prozac. Story 10. Not a doctor, but when I was maybe 14 or 13, I remember describing to my primary how during my periods I would pass out from the pain, couldn't move, or I would get sick, and told her a story about how I went on a trip to Italy and sometime in the middle of the flight became wildly sick to the point of terrifying the poor flight attendants. I'm so sorry, flight attendants. By filling 4 puke bags, crawling to the back of the plane, clutching my stomach, finding the doors locked, attempting to use the first-class bathrooms so I could finish being sick. When denied entry, just lay down in the aisle waiting for sweet, sweet death to take me. It did not. Death has terrible customer service, and then passed out when we exited the plane. But periods are supposed to be painful, right? The doctor was like, "Honey, you're supposed to experience some discomfort, not be incapacitated." Anyway, she put me on birth control, and I've never been happier. Story 11. I'm a patient who thought it was normal to have a headache nearly 24/7. It was actually the occasional absence of a headache that I initially believed to be problematic. Edit. There are a lot of people asking, largely via DM, what my disease is because they think they may have the same thing. I'll call my disease X for now. Headaches is one of dozens and dozens of symptoms of X. Headaches is not a defining characteristic of X, and many people with X do not have headaches. Headaches alone would definitely not lead to a diagnosis with X. X is also rare. It's so rare that if someone I know saw the name of X on a Reddit comment, they may actually know that anonymous Redditor 17 is me. Thank you for understanding why I'm keeping my diagnosis quiet online for now. I wish you all the best if you're struggling with headaches too. For me, water, sleep, and physiotherapy are enough to keep me fully functional despite my headaches. Story 12. Not a doctor, but I had an experience like this with someone I slept with. We had just finished and were cuddling when he remarked that he was happy. He felt like he was in his body. I looked at him funny and asked him what he meant, and he said, "You know that funny feeling you get after where you feel like you're not in your body? You're like looking at yourself from the opposite side of the room?" Well, right now I don't feel like that. I feel happy instead. I tried my best to not look horrified, and I asked him if it was always like that for him. He explained to me that it only started happening after something awful happened to him 2 years ago. I had to do my best to gently explain that no, I do not get that funny feeling, and most people don't. I also had to explain, to the best of non-professional capacity, what disassociation was. Edit. Just wanted to clarify that me being horrified was out of genuine concern for his well-being. I was worried he was raped or something horrible, not judgment for having any sort of mental illness. Story 13. I feel like my story belongs here, even though I'm the patient, since the exact scenario happened to me. A few years back, my mental health totally took a skydive. As a result, I dropped out of school and had to start a recovery program. The first thing I had to do was talk to a psychologist. During these conversations with the psychologist, she'd focus on different parts of my life. So one day she'd ask about relationships, and the next, childhood memories, and so on. After a few conversations, she focused on my social life. I then told her that it's pretty much non-existent, and it always has been. She then stated that I must have suffered from loneliness a lot then. I just told her that I've never actually felt lonely at any point in my life. After all, it's pretty hard to feel lonely with the two voices in your head always keeping conversation. But surely she knew that, right? Well, as it turns out, no. Apparently everybody else only have their own voice in their head. My entire life has been a lie. Turns out I'm schizophrenic. Who TF knew, eh? Story 14. I had a root canal needed in a molar. I went in so he could prep it for the next step, but 2 hours in, and he had to call it for the day. So by the fourth 2-hour visit, when it was finally done, I was sick of seeing my dentist. Almost a year later, I'm back at the dentist, and he turns to his assistant and says, "This is the one with that root canal." I'm a legend, apparently. Story 15. This happened to me. I woke up with a period so heavy the bed was soaked, stood up and it just poured out of me, clots the size of my palm. Overwhelmed, I did what any woman would do, if they could, and phoned my mom to come over and comfort me and help me clean up the mess. At this point, I was still thinking, this is a strangely heavy period, and I was more worried about how my landlord would react to the carpet. I then fainted, woke up, fainted again, phoned mom to cry about my stupid period making me miss work. My parents called an ambulance that arrived to the house first and rushed me to hospital. Not period. Massive internal hemorrhage in the womb. Story 16. Obligatory. I'm not a doctor, but I have celiac disease and am in the process of getting a Hashimoto's hypothyroidism diagnosis. I was the abnormal patient when I was a little kid, because not only did I get monthly bladder infections, apparently I had to use a catheter for a while, but I don't remember that at all. My doctor was confused why I always had extreme gas, joint pain, and weekly headaches at the ripe old age of 6. Turns out it was just me slowly dying because I ate a lot of wheat bread with celiac disease. Story 17. I'm a patient. Growing up, I assumed I was struggling in school because I was just a stupid miserable. I had zero confidence in myself or anyone else. Sometimes I would go days without sleeping. Other times I would sleep all day. I thought about my own death constantly. I truly believed that I was a flawed person and that it would always be that way. Turns out I actually have bipolar disorder. And thanks to medications and therapy, I am a normal functioning human now. Mostly anyway, lol. Story 18. When I was in medical school, I had a mother come in because her son was having behavioral issues at school. He was skipping, depressed. Didn't take long to find out he had encopresis. He basically pooped himself without knowing it, which would be hard at any age, but especially in school. Deep dive. He played Xbox every waking moment with no bathroom breaks, stretched things out until he lost sensation and stuff could squeeze out. Edits. Sorry, late night posting. Swipe. Lots of edits made based on used comments and feedback. Story. 19. I was the patient. When I was growing up, I had constant stomach aches. Every time I ate, I'd get sick. I went to the doctor multiple times for it, but they could never figure out what was wrong. Eventually, I started to think that everyone lives with pain like that, and I was just being a wimp and couldn't deal with it. I barely ate, such that I was super underweight. I was miserable all the time. I was constantly stressed and depressed because of this problem. Fast forward to grad school. My first year is in China. I'm there for a few months and then, over time, my symptoms disappear. I don't have stomach aches anymore. I gain about 40 pounds seemingly overnight. Now I'm at a healthy, doctor-approved weight. My depressive symptoms disappear almost entirely. But how could that happen? What could have caused such a change? Turns out, I'm lactose intolerant. I grew up in the Midwest where pretty much everything has dairy in it, and I'd been eating it constantly for so long, it took months for my system to reset. Being in China where dairy isn't such a staple made all the difference. I felt like such an idiot when I realized that was what was making me ill. On the plus side, I feel better, look better, and am a much happier person now. Constant nausea and stomach aches are not normal. Story 20. I was the patient, but I walked into an urgent care clinic after I had pushed my teeth through my bottom lip. I was covered in blood and had a large hole in my face. I told the nurse who did the intake I was having trouble drinking water and was worried about dehydration and did not acknowledge the new face hole. She got real freaked out. Story 21. I currently have a patient who, for no seemingly good reason, consumes food via their nose. It wasn't so bad when it was a softened diet, but the salad was a real shocker. Story 22. Obligatory the patient. I thought for years that I was just continually getting more and more out of shape. Despite my best efforts, nothing helped. I would just hit this wall and couldn't keep going. Eventually, I couldn't walk from my driveway to my house without needing a break to breathe. Turns out, shortness of breath isn't just something to wave away. It's also something I wish doctors had taken seriously. In the span of 2 weeks, I went from seeing a local clinic PA to being admitted to the ICU. My doctor told my husband he had no idea how I was still alive, nevertheless functioning. Story 23. Not a doctor, but I had close calls. For a few years, I often found myself falling asleep at certain time, often after work. However, with family advice, I went to the doctors and explained the symptoms. I was checked by a specialized in autoimmune diseases, as that ran in the family. I was given an X-ray and blood work. They noticed my thyroid wasn't working, given the second of 2 cancer scares. I was eventually diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis and psoriasis, thanks to unusual on my skin. I was put on hormones and steroids, likely for life. Story 24. Customary. Not a doc therapist part, but I don't know if I'll ever forget the moment I was told by my psychiatrist that I, 12 at the time, was experiencing emotional abuse from my mother. It was an immediate, not my mother, surely, because at 12 you totally know what abuse is. I, 13 years later, can definitely say that I was raised in an emotionally and physically abusive household. Story 25. I was the patient, but mine was kind of backwards of the whole thing. I feel like it's close enough to fit. When I lie down on my back, my feet turn out lay completely flat. They've always done this. My bones and my legs are twisted, and that's the most comfortable position for them. This was the day after I broke my pelvis and I was going to the doctors to see what the damage was. The doctor didn't know about my feet, so he had this terrified look on his face when he saw me and headed back out. My mom had to talk to him and tell him, no, that was normal because he assumed I broke both hips. Story 26. It was more like, I realized what was happening was not normal, and it led to the client being diagnosed with what I can only assume was rapid cycling bipolar 2 with psychotic features. Was referred to a more appropriate agency after initial intake, so I didn't do the official diagnosis. He came in and was so down about his life that I called in another therapist to do a suicide assessment together. Once we were going through the questions, the client became excited at having an audience and did a 180 in demeanor. I had never experienced someone flip so quickly. Aside from the mental health stuff, the client was a really cool person whom I hoped would get proper medication and go on to live a happier life. Lots of achievable hopes and dreams, and a really intelligent person, delusions aside. Story 27. Until I was 19, I didn't know it was unusual for my feet to hurt every moment of every day. A lot. I have incredibly flat feet. They literally suction to the floor and make farting noises. I assumed that, like people told me, I was just incredibly lazy. Turns out, most people didn't grow up in constant pain. Thanks, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Story 28. Us therapists tend not to judge. If it doesn't cause significant stress and impairment in your daily life, then who am I to say it's not normal or bad? And most of the stuff we see on a daily basis isn't considered normal by most people, like hearing voices, communicating with the dead through the purchase of lottery tickets, or believing you doctor is trying to kill you. Story 29. I'm a doc. It's about me. In my psych rotation, me and my fellow students were interviewing this anhedonic patient. A guy asked him, does it feel like nothing matters and that you'd rather die? I promptly responded, of course, but that's just normal. Thinking about death because there's so many bad things in the world that we know for sure are happening, but have no actual way of subverting or preventing. In my mind, scenes of forced prostitution, organ harvesting, domestic abuse, serial rape, sadistic torture. They just all collectively said, no, that's not normal. If you're having problems, please tell us more. I just responded, oh, and justified in my head that it's just a lack of proper communication. Story 30. I was fat. I thought my belly button, about 10 cm in diameter, was huge because I was fat. No one knows how long I actually had the hernia for. When it was first diagnosed, the docs tried to push it back in and it wouldn't go. I was told that due to my chronic severe brittle asthma and prescribed steroid use that I wouldn't be given surgery to fix it unless it was strangulated. 7 years later, surgery was planned for a year after another surgery. It strangulated during an exam I was videoed for. I finished the exam, and I had emergency surgery a couple of days later. My lecturer was marking the exam and noted that I went very pale and started sweating halfway through the exam. I passed the exam, although I am sure I could have gotten a medical certificate if I hadn't. Story 31 was on urology rotation in medical school when a 20-something-year-old male presented with the complaint that one of his nuts was too small, and he wanted them to be equal because it was embarrassing. One testicle was normal, the too small one, while the other was the size of a grapefruit. Unfortunately, the cancer had metastasized. Not sure how he did long-term as I rotated off the service after he had surgery. Story 32. As a patient, I went in for a standard sleep study because I was always exhausted. Doctor asked me afterwards if I would consider signing a release for him to write a paper on me. Apparently, I moved my legs over 9,000 in the course of the night. Apparently, it was RLS I wasn't realizing I had. My wife never even told me I did it and I had no idea. She casually agreed after I told her what the doc said. I barely met the recs for moderate sleep apnea, where they will RX a machine. God, I love that thing. I sleep so much better with it. Wifey, on the other hand, uses hers and sleeps with her mouth open. So annoying to listen to the air hiss out all night. Story 33. I was the patient. My parents rushed me to A&E because I'd taken something like 18 paracetamol tablets in less than 24 hours. I'd read stories online about people who'd killed themselves that way, either intentionally or not. I wasn't suicidal or anything. My stomach just hurt really bad that day, and I kept falling asleep so it was hard to keep track of time. When I say bad, I mean absolute agony. I couldn't move. I was vomiting everything up. Paracetamol barely puts a dent in it sort of pain. I figured this was normal pain for getting stomach cramps, i.e., from bad food. I got them a lot, to some extent every day, but the severity varied wildly. I figured I was just a complete wimp about normal levels of pain. I'd gone to doctors previously, but every time I'd been told that this was heartburn. A few times it was apparently because I had a test later in the week. Anyway, they take some bloods and it turns out that I had pancreatitis, and have had this same condition pretty much every time the pain got so severe, I had trouble staying awake. The doctors at the pediatric A&E just didn't want to take my bloods for whatever reason. Story 34. I got tonsillitis a few years back. I suffered through it for about a week, but my wife convinced me to go to the doctors for antibiotics. Got there, and the doctor found it weird that I had to look up to talk. I had to, because that was the only way to create enough room in my throat to talk. She looks at my tonsils and says, "Yeah, we're going to have to keep you in hospital. If your tonsils swell anymore, you're going to stop breathing." I apparently have weirdly large tonsils, and the swelling from tonsillitis was almost enough to close my thought. Story 35. Obligatory. Not a doctor or therapist note, I am the dumb patient here. I complained about how it was so unfair that I was discriminated against and made fun of because I couldn't recognize people. Turns out that what I and everyone else thought was a bad memory or laziness was actually face blindness. Story 36. I had what I thought was a mild staph skin infection that just wouldn't go away. I ended up having to see an infectious diseases specialist and was on high-dose antibiotics for 18 months. 2 pills 4 times a day. Story 37. Didn't realize until college when having a discussion in a psychology class that most people have a mind's eye and can see things visually in their mind. I have never had a daydream and thought I just didn't have an imagination. Turns out I have aphantasia. Story 38. I'm not the doctor, but I found out about half a year ago that it's not normal for your shoulders to regularly dislocate chalk subluxate. Found out after having severe pain after one subluxation, shoulder capsula was torn, and I was asked what happened. D. So how did it happen? Me. IDK? It just happened. So you didn't fall awkwardly or got hit real hard? Me. No, it's just what happens every day. But the pain has never been this bad and this long-lasting, D. So you subluxate your shoulders every day? Me. Of course, isn't that normal? D. Okay, I'm gonna get you into the orthopedic surgeon as soon as possible. Also, I have a skin disease that only comes in male and female of 20 to 30 years old. I've had it since I was 4. Story 39. When I was young, I had an overbite that needed to be corrected by my orthodontist. He gave me the option to use headgear at night for a few years, or use what they call a Herbst device. After deliberating with the family, we decided I would go with the Herbst device. as it would only take 1 year to correct the overbite. So, I lived with this thing in my mouth for 1 year, and it sucked. Every facet of it sucked. My bottom jaw was covered with a plastic plate, and rods pushed my jaw forward. Finally, the day came when they were to remove the device. I think anyone who's had braces can relate to the feeling of impending oral freedom and the excitement therein. They removed the plate and the rods, but left the palate expander in, because it had not yet reached the development they were looking for. This is a good time to mention the rods were attached to my palate expander with screws, and the bottom half of the rods were attached with screws to my bottom molars. After a couple of weeks, I started to lose weight and hardly talk. I didn't want to talk because my mouth hurt too badly. I thought it was normal after having a procedure like this. They chiseled cement from my bottom teeth under the plate and nicked up my cheeks and gums as a result. One night at dinner, my mom got frustrated by the fact that I wouldn't speak. I'd only nod or shake my head or barely open my mouth to let an easy word or two slip out. She asked to look into my mouth and found that they never removed the screws that the rods were attached to. The screws had buried themselves into my cheeks, and every time I'd eat or speak, the screws would pull and slip off of my cheeks. The ortho saw me the next days and removed them. I still have 4 scars in my mouth. Ortho told me that they'd almost gotten through my cheeks. Story 40. I was the patient. Apparently, it's not normal to think about how you want to die as a 10-year-old. Apparently, it's not normal to try. And when I turned 18 and finally went to therapy, I learned that apparently, it's not normal for someone as far gone as I was to know that they need help and to seek help on their own. Story 41. When I was 14, my therapist at the time had to explain to me that not everyone had periods of pure anxiety. I didn't understand her at all. I thought my mental illnesses were just normal and that everyone had them. I've been on meds for MDD, GAD, and PTSD for 6 years now. Still bewildered that people wake up and don't have a constant flutter in their abdomen. Story 42. I didn't know how much more often I cried than the average person. Average is 1 to 5x a month. As a kid up until I was 18-19, I cried on average 3-6x a week. Apparently, none of my teachers, parents, therapists, or counselors noticed that it was out of the ordinary for a child to cry themselves to sleep most nights, or just burst into tears in the middle of class. It led to a lot of bullying and other stuff, and now I'm not sure I've ever been 100% depression-free. I also thought it was normal to have mental breakdowns often. Like once a day, near daily screaming, breaking things, hitting, injuring yourself, dissociating, honestly terrified of yourself and being alone. Insomnia, brain actually hurts from how shitty your thoughts are, etc. I grew out of some of it and learned how to keep most of it behind closed doors. But I still have breakdowns a couple times a month. Some weeks, for instance, the last few, I'll have one daily, or more. Turns out that them just rolling their eyes at my breakdowns when I was a kid might have been neglect. The first time I broke down in front of a therapist, not even a bad episode for me, she recommended hospitalization. And also, she quit as my therapist. Anyways, yeah, it's been getting worse again. Much worse. But at least now I know it's not a normal thing people go through. Story 43. Not a doctor, that thing had happened to me myself. For around half a year, I had cramps each night, lost weight, could not, had worsening eyesight, my urine smelled weirdly, my skin was extremely dry, etc. I had seen a doctor about the cramps since those were the first thing. He had recommended magnesium, but that did not help. Anyway, I went on like, that is gonna get better for almost half a year, until I saw the same doctor once again and had him take a blood test. Turns out, I have diabetes type 1. He could not even tell me the difference between the types 1 and 2 though, so I never went to him again. Story 44. Not an oddity or habit, but I was the patient having 48-hour ambulatory EEG done over the weekend. Had it put on a Friday, go back Monday. Hour or so after it went on, I started noticing it hurting where all the leads are. I'm thinking, no one told me this would be so uncomfortable. I couldn't sleep all weekend. My head was burning. I couldn't get in touch with the doctor. I called the on-call. Doctor who said that was no normal if it was too intense. Go to the ER and get it off or come in as soon as the clinic opens Monday. I waited, paced all weekend and kept myself occupied. Monday morning they took it off. The leads burned into my skin all over my forehead and scalp. I'm apparently allergic to that metal on the leads and never knew and was having an allergic reaction. The burns were so bad and deep, I had to see a plastic surgeon. Story 45. I was the patient. I thought for the first 20 years of my life that everyone woke up with headaches that took an hour to go away. Turns out I had sleep apnea, and that headache was from the lack of oxygen. I woke up more refreshed than I'd ever felt in my life after a sleep study. It also turned out, not helping it, that my tonsils were abnormally large. So when I had them taken out, they also went in and took out my uvula. When I went to a new PCP after moving, she looked in my mouth and deadpanned. I feel like you may have forgotten to mention something on the paperwork. Story 46. For 6 months, I'd be woken up with pain around my midsection. I thought it was my fibromyalgia flaring up. Until one night I was in the second worst pain I've been in and rushed to the ER. Gallstone the size of a golf ball. They took the whole organ out. Story 47. Plenty of women are giving alcohol to their 1 to 6 months old kids to put them to sleep. Generations are raised like this in my country, and it's harder to explain why it is wrong than you think. Story 48. I'm the patient on these. 1. After my second pregnancy, I had what I thought was an outie belly button. I'd had it for years and didn't realize that what I actually had was an umbilical hernia. It never hurt, so I just assumed it was fine. 2. I had a CAT scan as a teenager, and the doctors told me that almost all of my organs are larger than they should be, considering my size, 5'2", 120 lbs. I always had a little bit of a belly and thought I should just lose 5 lbs. Or something, but it turns out that it's my colon. When I get bloated, I look really pregnant. It's crazy. I also had what they called an accessory spleen, which is just an extra bit of spleen in an adjacent location, I guess. I always envisioned this as looking like a handbag, seeing as how it's an accessory and all. Story 49. I guess I'm the patient. I had epilepsy when I was young, put on carbamazepine. I was on that for 8 to 9 years at a very high dose. Simply the NHS forgot I was on it and kept prescribing it. A doctor eventually took me off it. I had to wean off it for a fair while. The nub is when I was young I had an excellent memory. I could remember the most minutest detail. My family sometimes told me I was a memory bank. After that point, my memory is shockingly bad, like entire long chunks of time just gone. For example, I did a project at work about a year ago, which took a long time. Someone logged a bug on my code, zero memory of my ever producing it. I thought it was a normal thing, just getting old. I think I asked a question on here, but the upshot was, go get it checked out. My girl at the time was particularly vocal about it, demanding that my memory problems were not normal. I figured out there were times where I was doing something but had no idea what was going on, but remained perfectly fine. We would have conversations and I'd have no idea what we were discussing. I'd remember events totally out of order in terms of sequence or completely wrong, i.e., conversations with multiple people who couldn't possibly have been there. Lots of things. I went for EEGs, discussed my absences, how I usually remember things by attributing certain facts to some sort of number trick which I wasn't really conscious of. I just did it. Realized that I would do things, e.g. a date, and remember nothing of it. This isn't constant, it's just random. I also get sleep paralysis and the rest of it. While this sounds horrific, it's not too bad. I have T, but I don't view it as life unlivable. Just sometimes I won't remember things, even with heavy prompting. I was offered a control drug, but I declined as I don't think I'm bad enough. It doesn't irritate me enough to do it. I just live by my wall calendar, a couple of notepad, TXT files on my computer, and that does me fine. Story 50. My son was the patient, his therapist was on the second level and we took the stairs instead of the elevator. At the beginning of each appointment, I'd go in for a few minutes, and on this particular day I was extremely winded and couldn't catch my breath. I hadn't really noticed it until she pointed out that my breathing wasn't normal and I should get myself checked out. She was right. I had PEs, blood clots, in both of my lungs, and I wound up in the hospital for a week, and while I was there I learned that I have chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Good times. Story 51. Patient here. I used to randomly experience my heart racing, shortness of breath, arms feeling heavy and achy, and a panicked sensation. As early as 10. I told my pediatrician it happened when I forgot to breathe. He said nobody forgets to breathe and brushed it off. 11 years later, it turns out I had asthma all that time, but instead of attacks, my heart would just have to race to catch up because it wasn't getting enough oxygen. My lungs were at 56% capacity. Promptly started 2 inhalers, and started being able to talk and hike at the same time.